So today what we're going to do is begin our look at Lesson 3C, but we're going to take two different days to do it. We're going to look at, first of all, converting between units, and then next time we're going to look at some perimeter and area questions. So it's just a long section, so we're going to break it up into two. In the metric system, there are three main units of measurement. Okay. We have the meter, which is just abbreviated plain old M, and that is the measurement for length, the basic unit for length. Excuse me. We have the kilogram, and that's the basic unit for mass, which we usually think of mass and weight as the same thing because on Earth it is. If you went to a different planet, then they're not the same, but they are the same on Earth. And then we have S, which stands for seconds, and that's the basic units for time. Now, we're going to learn how to convert from one unit to another, because when you have very large objects, you wouldn't want to measure them in meters. You might measure them in kilometers, or etc. Or very, very tiny units, we want to use different units for those. So we're going to look at converting units in the most common forms. So we're not looking at every single form, but we're going to look at the most common ones. And luckily, these follow a very distinct pattern that's very easy to memorize. Okay? So what we're going to do, first of all, is to convert units. You need to think about, are you going from larger units to smaller units or smaller units to larger units? If you're going from large to small, then what's going to happen is, instead of a few big pieces, you're going to have lots of smaller pieces, right? So it may seem a little contrary because you're going from larger units to smaller units, but in that case, you're always going to multiply. Just think of it like that. You're always going to have bigger units. For bigger units, you're going to have fewer of them. So to take them to smaller units, you need to multiply because you're going to have a lot more, right? When you cut them into smaller pieces. From smaller to larger, you'll do exactly the opposite. You're going to be dividing. Because if you have bigger units, you're going to have fewer of them. Right? Now, knowing these two and when to do what are probably the biggest hurdle for converting between units. Because if you think about going from larger to smaller, in mathematics or mathematically, to get from a larger number to a smaller number, we would divide, right? But we're not talking about a number here. We're talking about a number of units. And you're going to have more of them if they're smaller. So it takes a little doing, but you just kind of remember, and you might want to write it down, right? Large to small, multiply, small to large, divide. When you get your exam or you're working on things, write it down a few times so that you'll remember those. Okay? Now, we're going to look at a couple of different scenarios of units and what happens for each one. In 3C, we're going to be talking about measurements, so we're going to be talking about lengths. But we're also going to be talking about areas of objects, and then we're going to talk about some three-dimensional objects and the space inside, also known as volume. So we're going to look at different measurements. Fortunately, they still use the same four basic units. So, if you're talking about length, now there are more units of length than this, but these are the four most common ones. You have kilometers, which means 1,000 meters. You have the base unit of meters, and getting smaller than meters, you have centimeters and millimeters. Now there are other units. There is decimeter between those. Between these two, there are two others. There's deca and hecto, but they're so infrequently used that we don't even consider them when we're dealing with most of the time, right? Most of the time, these will do it. If they're very, very tiny units, we measure them in millimeters. They're really big units. We measure them in kilometers. Now, there will be times when you do a few others, but we'll list those special cases in a minute. Now, remember, if you're going from a larger unit to a smaller unit, you're going to use what operation? Multiply or divide?
Divide.
Seems like it should be, but it's actually multiply, right? So we're going to be converting between these. And it's really easy if you think about it. The further to the left you go, the bigger the units. So you're going to start off with the biggest number, and then you're going to go down. First, to go from kilometers to meters, you would multiply by 1,000. And again, you have to memorize these, but they're super easy to recognize because from meters to centimeters is times 100. 1 less 0. And from centimeters to millimeters, it's times 10. So 1,110. So you're just dropping off a 0 each time. Okay? So it's really easy to remember. If you can remember kilo is 1,000, then the rest of them just drop a 0. Now, that's if you're going from larger units to smaller units. You'll use those numbers as multipliers. And we're going to use the same exact factors as we go the other direction. But this time, instead of multiply, I'm going to divide. So divide by 1,000, divide by 100, divide by 10. And because these are the most common units, it's really easy to remember that 1,110. And you're going to have to because that's also what you're going to use. The same multipliers or the same factors, you're going to use those for area and for volume. Okay? But for area, if you think about area, that means the space inside, right? So like the floor, the area of the floor, we have length and we have width. So that's two different units multiplied together. And so you get square units. So for these, we're still going to get kilometers, but they're going to, because we're measuring area, they're going to be kilometers squared. Then we'll get meters squared, centimeters squared, and millimeters squared. And if we square the units, what's going to happen is we're also going to square the factors. So it's still multiplication as you move to smaller units. It's still times 1,000 times 100 times 10. But because these are squared, these are also squared. So super easy to remember. If you're working with square units, then you need to square your multiplier. And the same thing happens if you're going in the other direction. We're going to divide by the same exact numbers, except because we're working with square units, we're going to square the factors. Now, squaring it means multiplying it times itself, but if you multiply 10 times 10, all it does is add another 0. So it just doubles the number of zeros you have when you square something that's all with one with all zeros. So it's very easy to write those out. So 1,000 squared, instead of 3 zeros, it would have twice that many, so 6 zeros. Okay? And then the last types of units we're going to look at volume. And with volume, what happens is you have volume would be the airspace inside this room. So we're going to have length, we're going to have width, and we're also going to have height. So that's 3 different measurements. So our measurements in the case of volumes are all cubed or raised to the 3rd power. Oops. And so, as you can imagine, if you're going to cube the units, then you're also going to cube your factors. So instead of times 1,000, it's times 1,000 raised to the 3rd power. So these numbers can get huge very quickly. So times 100 to the 3rd power, times 10 to the 3rd power. But just like the other ones, all it does is, instead of doubling the amount of zeros, it triples it. Okay? So the math is still easy, but the numbers are going to get really big, really fast. Okay? And again, all you have to do is remember the type of units you're using, and that'll tell you and remind you if you have to square it or cube it. So there are lots of great relations when you're dealing with when you're dealing with the metric system. Now the same process would be used for liquids, except instead of meters, what's the basic unit for liquids? Liters. There you go. And the same thing would be done for mass, but instead of for mass, instead of meters or liters, you would have grams. And gram is really a tiny, tiny little object, so more frequently we use kilograms. But you might want to you still go to grams or centigrams or milligrams. Okay. All right. A couple of special ones that you need to know, and we might run across a few more, and that's what happens when you have a ton. And 1 ton is 1,000 kilograms. So if you're going from ton to kilogram, you multiply by 1,000. If you go from kilogram to ton, you divide by 1,000. So just the same multiplier as if you're doing kilograms to meters, kilometers, to meters, etc. So with 1 ton is 1,000 kilograms. Right? There'll be a few others that are specific to the bigger units and some of the tinier units. For example, we'll talk about micrograms, possibly. I doubt it, but they are super tiny. Okay, they're 1,000 times smaller than. But you'll see some of those. If we run across the problems, then we'll worry about those. All right. So let's talk about converting them. When you're converting these units, the steps. Okay. First, write down your original units. Oops. And your new units. Take the time to write down, for example, that you're going from meters to kilometers. Who cares? Right? If you stop and slow yourself down a little bit to remind yourself of what's going on, it'll really make a difference when you're working with these. Second, choose multiplication or division. If we're getting smaller, what operation are we going to use? It's counterintuitive. If you're getting smaller, you're doing multiplying, right? If you're doing bigger, if you're going to bigger units, then you're going to use division. Okay? All right. It's very counterintuitive. 3, choose the factor. Now remember, a factor means the multiplier or the thing you're dividing by. They're both factors, no big deal. Choose the factor or factors. Because sometimes you might be going from a smaller unit to a much bigger unit. So you might have to multiply twice or times 2 different numbers. And we'll look at some examples about what I mean. Okay? So for example, say you're going from millimeters to meters. To get from millimeters to meters, I have to go through centimeters, right? So this from millimeters to centimeters is 10. From centimeters to meters is 100. So that's 10 times 100, or in other words, 1,000, right? So if you're making more than one jump, then you need both factors, either both multipliers or both divisors. Okay? So what we're going to do is just look at a couple of these very quickly. And so say, for example, and this is 1A from your homework that you're going to be doing. Oops. So if you're going from 5.7 meters to centimeters. So I have my units that I'm starting with, and I know what unit I'm going to. So am I going from larger to smaller or smaller to larger? Which one's bigger, meters or centimeters? Meters. So I'm going from a large unit to a small unit. So that means that I'm going to be using multiplication or division. Remember, it's counterintuitive. Multiplication. So I'm going to take my 5.7 times, and the jump from meters to centimeters means I'm going to be multiplying by 100, right? If you think back at your chart, from meters to centimeters, your multiplier is 100. And again, you're just going to have to memorize those. So 5.7 times 100. And you can either do that with your calculator, or you can remember that if you're multiplying by something with one with two zeros, it's just going to move that decimal 2 places to the right. So you can move the decimal so that become 570 centimeters. Or you can simply take 5.7 times 100 in your calculator, which is probably what you do anyway. Okay? Now, let's look at another one. So here, this is number 4 from your homework. It's 7860 millimeters to meters. Sir?
Can I get on my worker, please?
So we're going from millimeters to meters. So am I going from a small unit to a large unit, or a large unit to small? Small to large, right? And it's millimeters to meters. So if that's millimeters and this is meters, there's still one unit in between, which is centimeters. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be dividing by 100, but we're also going to be dividing by 10. So don't think of it as dividing by one or the other. What we have to do is we have to multiply those together to get our divisor. Right? Because we need to divide by both of them. So it's 7860 millimeters. So 7860 divided by 1,000. Remember, dividing by 1,000 is simply going to move that decimal how many places? 3 zeros, so 3 places, yeah? So right now it's at the end, so 1, 2, 3. So that's going to give me 7.86 meters. And I don't need the 0 at the end, but I certainly wouldn't count off if you left it. Okay? So if you have more than one factor that you're using, you always multiply them together. Even though we're dividing is our action to change the units, we would multiply the things together to find out what we divide by. Okay? A couple of other special units. A megaliter is 1 million liters. And anytime you see the word giga, that's always 1 billion, whatever. Mega is always a million. Giga is always a billion. Okay? So it's fairly straightforward. So for homework, please write this down. It's on your list if you don't. 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go to the exercises, and I am going to call on you and ask you questions, and we'll spend the rest of our time doing that.